Please remain seated. The show will begin in 3, 2...
Like a Hellcat.
Greetings, foolish mortals. I am your host, FandomTraveller87. Welcome back to my channel. I hope you all are doing very well. Before I get on to this next story, I just want to say thank you so much for listening. To all you horror fans and those who are freaky chic, and everything else in between. If anyone out there has a story that they would like to submit to my business email, hopegivesyouvings.com@gmail.com, to have your story featured, whether it be creepypasta related, or perhaps your own true horror experience, and if you wish to remain anonymous as well, then that's totally fine. I really look forward to seeing what you have in store for me. Now, the Haunted Mansion is one of my favorite Disney attractions. Now, I've never actually been on this ride before, but I've always had it on my bucket list. And this story in particular, when I first heard it, it always did fascinate me. So without further ado, let's dive right back into the crypt and get on to this next spine-chilling tale. Alright, let's do this. On June 4th, 1983, my high school was one of the many that took us to Disneyland for grad night. If you've ever been to Disneyland on grad night, you know how much fun and how crazy it can be. The park stays open extra late. The skippers who drive the Jungle Cruise boats let loose and tell dirty jokes, and there's plenty of opportunities for people to sneak booze and weed in. Getting a bunch of amped high schoolers in Disneyland is one thing, but with a nightlife and party atmosphere behind it, things can get pretty nuts. My two friends and I, Anaheim locals, were particularly excited. We all loved Disneyland, and while we didn't get to visit often, living practically in the park's backyard gave us more opportunities than most. In addition, we hadn't been since the new Fantasyland opened earlier that year, going from a sort of medieval fairground into a storybook village, so I was kind of looking forward to that. Unlike a lot of people who were there, we intended to keep things clean and have a grand old time of it, hit as many rides as possible and just revel. But the big plan for the night was kind of ambitious and maybe a little reckless. To this day, I can't remember who suggested it first, only that we all thought of it as a great idea. We had already got into the park and gone on a number of rides when it was brought up, while we were sitting on a bench in Frontierland eating churros. From where we sat, we could look across the rivers of America to Tom Sawyer Island, and past that where the river curved to New Orleans Square. Poking above the trees was the cupola of the Haunted Mansion, with its clipper ship weather vane. The sun had just gone down, and the sky was awash with dull orange and purple clouds, most of which seemed to loom behind the cupola. I pointed out how perfect and spooky the whole thing looked, and that got us talking about it. The mansion was a collective favorite, and being dumb kids, we agreed to do a little exploring, to effectively, quote-unquote, spend the night in the Haunted Mansion. We laughed about it as we got in line, moving past the brick columns and up the walk toward the mansion. But inside I was a bit nervous. You have to understand, security was a bit more lax back then, so it was plausible that we would be able to pull this off if we were careful. Plus, grad night always had kids getting into trouble, and the likelihood of us getting banned for good was not as high as it could have been, but I still felt tense. That feeling you get when you're scared about going on a thrill ride for the first time. Excited but hesitant. The three of us, Mike, Karen, and myself, had it all worked out. When you first enter the mansion, you're escorted into a room that seems to stretch and warp before your eyes, which is actually an elevator that takes guests below ground, where a hallway connects to the ride building beyond the park's berm. As everyone else crowded out of the room and into the hall of morphine portraits, we lagged behind, which the disembodied voice of the ghost host jokingly warns you not to do, and fell in at the very back of the line. By the time we piled into our doom buggy, there was no one else behind us, and the black endless procession of clamshell-like cars were empty. We went through the ride as normal, cracking jokes and making banter at all the old familiar scenes until we reached the exit crypt. We stepped out onto the moving platform and walked toward the escalator ramp that leads from the crypt back to the park outside. If you don't know, the escalator hugs the wall on the right, but on the left is a small crypt scene where a tiny ghostly bride stands on a stone shelf and tells you to hurry back. Hurry back. Mike took charge here, deliberately turning backwards as we went up to watch the cast member near the buggies below us. Mike's a big, broad-shouldered guy, a football player through and through, and his bulk hid me and Karen from view as we slowly ascended. At his signal, when the cast member monitoring the exit had his back turned, Karen and I climbed over the rail and dropped down into the crypt scene, where we quickly scurried under the dusty space beneath the escalator. Mike was over a moment later, and we laughed and congratulated each other on a job well done. We must have spent a good hour or so down there, giggling into our hands whenever we heard footsteps and voices overhead of the unsuspecting people exiting the ride. Karen even had some snacks she brought with her, and we sat there in the dark and ate and whispered to each other. It was like being in a weird clubhouse, and it felt good that we three shared this delinquency together, even as the narration of the ghost bride looped over and over again in the background.
Hurry back. Be sure to bring your death certificate. If you decide to join us, make final arrangements now. We've been dying to have you.
Eventually, the novelty wore off, and we got quiet, and then listless. Sure, we managed this much, but then what? Karen pointed out that it had been eerily silent for a while, other than the monotonous speech of the bride and other spooky ambient sounds. There were no more people coming up the ramp. Mike said he thought maybe the park had closed, but that made no sense because it was open all night on grad night. Not wanting to get in trouble, but also wondering what was up, I volunteered to clamber back up and take a look. When I did, using some of the crypt scenery for hand and footholds, I saw there was no one around, not even a cast member down at the unloading platform at the end. When I reported this, Mike and Karen climbed back up as well, and we went back down the unloading station to look around. All the doom buggies coming along the corridor were empty, and there was not a person in sight. It was odd, to say the least, and I felt that something was definitely off to have the place so empty. I was about to suggest turning around and heading back outside, when Mike said he'd always wondered where the doom buggies went after they dropped you off. They rounded a dark corner in the crypt area and vanished from sight, and Mike was curious what was down there. Now really, I should have said no, that there was no point, and that we could get into some serious trouble if we snooped around back there. It was probably just a utility corridor anyway, since the buggies just looped back around to the loading room anyway. But I was young, and I was stupid, and when presented with a golden opportunity like that, it was hard to pass up. So we went ahead and jumped into a doom buggy going by, and it slowly rounded the corner into the darkness. This was uncharted territory for us, and even if it turned out to be boring back there, at the very least, we'd get a chance to see it and maybe get another ride out of it. Hardly a day goes by where I regret not having said something. The main thing I remember was how Spartan it was. It wasn't quite pitch black, but it was even gloomier in there than the rest of the ride. There were small lights set into the walls on either side of the track, but they were low to the ground and far between. The walls were painted black, and the corridor seemed so narrow that I felt boxed in. It was quiet, too, other than the hum of the track moving the buggies. I felt tense, and Mike and Karen weren't helping that, because they looked tense, too. I think it was dawning on all of us how much trouble we might get in. I think a minute or so had passed like this, us going down that dark, featureless backstage corridor. when the ride suddenly stopped and I nearly jumped out of my skin as a voice came from somewhere overhead and laughed when I realized I'd been startled by the normal breakdown spiel.
Playful spooks have interrupted our tour. Please remain seated in your doom buggy. We will proceed in just a moment.
The teasing was immediate, as we all pointed out to each other how we jumped. We waited for the ride to start again, and every 30 seconds or so the spiel would say,
We have been unappointedly detained by prankish spirits. Kindly remain seated in your doom buggy. We will continue our tour momentarily.
This went on for a good long while, 10, maybe 15 minutes, and still the buggies hadn't moved. No one had come looking for us. We were getting antsy, and the silence between the announcements was becoming unsettling. Then Karen leaned out a bit and looked around, and she noticed the door first. Just ahead, past the buggy in front of us, work lights revealed a tiny alcove and a utility door on the right-hand side of the corridor. We were so sick of being in the buggy by that point, we were willing to try anything. So after a short discussion, we all squeezed out of the buggy, pressed against the wall to go past the next one. Mike had trouble here, and stood before the door. I pushed it open, finding it unlocked, and it led to a metal staircase leading down the corridor, revealing where to go. I was thinking up excuses in my head as we went down the stairs to explain why we're likely stepping into Disney's utility corridors, the famous utilidors said to run like a spiderweb beneath Disneyland. If someone found us, and by this point I hoped someone did. At the bottom of the stairs, another closed door with a sign on it reading cast members only. We pushed through that as well, and were legitimately surprised to see that it opened into what looked like a themed hallway. Disney, even backstage, seemed to be paying attention to style, as this hall sported the purple demon wallpaper and wainscoting of the rooms above it. It was even lit by table sconces on the walls, the fake flickering bulbs coated with cobwebs and dust. Several detailed wooden doors lined the hall, with out-of-place white placards mounted to them. Each was marked as a prop room with a corresponding number. As we made our way up the hall, we tried each door we came to, and found them all locked. The first door, prop room 1, shook a bit but wouldn't budge. Same with 2 and 3. Mike chuckled and said he wondered if we would find Walt Disney's frozen head down there, but I could hear a nervous waver in his laugh. Even I was feeling some sense of dread with each door we tried, something hard to place but nagging. At door 4, I put my ear to the edge of it and thought I heard what sounded like rushing water or faint TV static from the other side, and at 5 I noticed that the Fox candles flanking it were flickering more sporadically than the rest, like they were faulty. Door 6, to the left and near another plain utility door that marked the hall's end, was the only one that yielded to us, and I was the one who turned the cold handle and opened it for the first time. It's difficult for me to describe what I saw in there without shuddering, because even now my telling makes it sound fairly normal. That is, as normal as a room hidden under a theme park attraction can possibly be. It wasn't very big, almost like a large storage shed. Unlike the hall, this one was the bland utility black, and lit by a single fluorescent light in the ceiling, a dim one. The walls were lined with metal cabinets, and there was some sort of large archaic gadget shoved into one corner, not unlike the old computer banks from the 1960s. But what caught my attention right away was the grinning figure near the far wall, across from the door, dummy or animatronic of some sort, lifeless and unmoving, but standing on its base. The discovery was fascinating to all of us, and without thinking, we all edged into the room and immediately approached the figure. It was clearly meant to be one of the ghosts in the ride, a specter in a top hat, the skull-like face, cartoony bulging eyes, and a leering smile. One of the teeth was even painted gold. He stood in a bow-legged stance, one gnarled hand holding a cane and the other a hat box. None of us had ever seen this particular character on the ride before, even though Karen said its face looked like a lot like the tall, skinny hitchhiking ghost from the end of the ride. I was just turning away from the figure to look at the cabinets when there was a combustion roar from the hall outside, like the sound of a passing motorcycle, followed by the loud, bassy boom that made the floor shake. The door to the room swung shut, and the fluorescent light sputtered and went out, leaving us in total darkness. Mike gasped and Karen screamed, and I was just reaching out for them in the dark when I heard a peculiar whirring sound. Another light came on, this one a concentrated green light above the Hatbox Ghost, showing its skeleton smile for a moment before that light faded and another faded on, illuminating the Hatbox. I could see through the material of the Hatbox now, and saw the ghost's head grinning at me from inside. The pattern repeated itself rhythmically, making it seem like the ghost's head was disappearing from his shoulders and appearing in the Hatbox. It wasn't a terribly convincing effect, but in the dark and with the strange things going on around me, it genuinely scared me. I turned and stumbled through the room, ready to get out of there, feeling around for the door. Now even the light on the ghost shut off, and I heard Karen and Mike's feet behind me, a crash, and then the sound of something solid tapping the concrete floor. But I tried pushing the door open, but it wouldn't budge, and somebody slammed into my back in the dark, and it caused me to hit it hard. I was dazed but unhurt, and another scream from Karen fueled my adrenaline even more. I instead gave the door a tug, and it opened. I was out in the hall without a second thought, and without even looking back, I started running, sprinting back the way I had come, gasping for air. I was never a very athletic kid, but panic kept me going. I heard sounds behind me, footsteps, Mike and Karen yelling in terror as they followed, and what seemed like rapid knocking and banging on the doors around me. But I refused to look over my shoulder, up the stairs, and back into the doom buggy corridor in what felt like a matter of seconds. The doom buggies were moving now, endlessly traveling through the shadows. I knew it was risky to jump into one in this narrow corridor, and for a moment I stopped, trying to figure out what to do. I finally looked back down the stairway I had come from. I thought Mike and Karen had been right behind me, but they were gone. I called out their names, my voice echoing down the stairs, but there was no reply. Not until I heard something tapping the metal stairs, coming up toward the door, and saw an unfamiliar vague shadow on the wall, that I had flung the door closed and dove into the nearest buggy, which carried me down the corridor a little ways before finally emerging into the limbo-like loading room. All of the effects were still running here, including the eerie music and sounds, but there was still no one else around. I yelled for help, but nobody appeared. As soon as I could jump out of the doom buggy and ran back up the line into the hall of morphing portraits. Ahead was the door to the elevator, the stretching gallery, but I remembered that this area had a more immediate chicken exit, meant for those too scared to ride the ride and wanted to head back up to the park. The door was marked with an obvious exit sign, sitting between two shuttered windows that made it look like it led outside to a stormy night. And without hesitating, I pushed through that as well. Beyond was another corridor on either side of me, flashing lights pointed at windows to stimulating light, flickering with each thunderclap that boomed through the hall, disorienting me even further. Turning left, I followed the hall as the door inclined gently up, my throat tight and a stitch in my side, and then my throat closed altogether. As I turned a corner, almost ran into the Hatbox Ghost. It was standing smack dab in the middle of the hall between me and the door that led outside. I scrambled backward instinctively, but the figure didn't move. It was a static prop. It grinned, its cadaver grin, backlit by a ceiling light further down the hall. The light also broke the illusion of the Hatbox, and I could see vaguely the shape of the disembodied head through the scrim. I was convinced, thoroughly convinced at that moment, that thing was going to suddenly jerk to life and come after me. But it didn't. I had no idea how it had gotten there from down in the sub-level, or how it had so quickly. Maybe the one I'd seen below wasn't the only figure. Maybe Mike and Karen were pulling a fast one on me and had dragged the figure up with them. I was frozen, trying to figure out where to go next, not wanting to go anywhere near the ghost, but not wanting to backtrack either, because I still felt there was something sinister behind me. Nervously, I croaked out the names of my lost friends, but there was no reply. Noises from the ride seemed to come floating down the hall, muted but ever present. Then I heard the groan. It could have been a human groan or something mechanical, but I definitely heard it. It didn't sound like any of the standard audio, and it came from a point somewhere near or past the Hatbox Ghost, maybe even from further down the corridor past the exit. As if this were a trigger, I realized that either my eyes had adjusted to the dark, or the lighting had somehow changed, because I looked again at the Hatbox and saw the thing inside the scrim. There was still a head in there, but I know it wasn't the ghost's head. It wasn't even a cartoon caricature of a head. It wasn't Mike or Karen. It's at this point the details elude me. I know that what I saw shook me to my very core, and that's part of the reason it has taken me so long to recount this. I remember seeing the thing in the box, seeing that it was indeed a human head, a man's face, a face I didn't recognize, seemingly looking back out at me with shocked, pleading eyes. But after that, there was a blur of sheer terror and snatches of frightening images, gnarled hands, tombstones, pneumatic hissing, the stretching room going in reverse, shrinking too fast, the ceiling rushing toward me, the corpse hanging in the rafters descending on me. I tried not to dwell on them too much, because now I'm no longer sure what really happened, and which were the results of the nightmares I'd had for years after. The next thing I can remember clearly after that is being on my hands and knees just outside the fence of the haunted mansion, vomiting onto the pavement while around me crowds of people stood. Most of them weren't paying me any mind. There was lots of whispered talk and a few were crying. There were red and blue lights, police cars parked nearby, but I couldn't tell why. I just sat there gulping and sobbing until a cast member finally noticed me and led me to a first aid station. Karen was there when I arrived. She jumped up and hugged me tight when she saw me. I don't think either of us made much sense. We were both at our wits' end. But it was such a relief to see her after all that any questions I had fell by the wayside. I'll never forget how haunted she looked, wide-eyed and pale, barely able to form a sentence without tearing up. Mike never turned up. That fateful night has never left me. And in the years since then, I've slowly begun to piece together the details, trying to vainly make sense of what happened. It became sort of a private obsession, something to do in the background, as I moved on with my life. First, it didn't take long for Karen and I to learn why the police cars were there, and they weren't for us. According to the reports we heard later, an 18-year-old guy from New Mexico had died while we were in the haunted mansion. He and a friend had snuck into a backstage area on Tom Sawyer's Island and stole a rubber emergency boat to go for a joyride around the rivers of America. Apparently this guy was pretty drunk, and it wasn't long before he hit a rock, throwing him and his friend from the boat. His friend went for help, but he drowned before they could find him. His body was discovered an hour later. I wonder now if that's why no one was around when we crept backstage. I managed to track down a few cast members who were working that night, and though most of them claim that they were told by management to not cause alarm and keep to their posts, several admitted they had gone to check out the grim spectacle, especially those CMs that were on attractions near the river, like the haunted mansion. Was the timing such that everyone turned a blind eye while we stumbled into something hideous? Mike's disappearance was something Karen and I had both felt deeply, and we tried for years to get something from anyone about it. His parents never heard from him, and a missing persons report was filed. We didn't tell the truth. Who would believe us? We at least tried to steer the investigation toward the haunted mansion, saying that was where we last saw him, but it never went that far. Disney never got implicated in the incident, of course, though the park was his last known whereabouts. Karen and I eventually drifted, probably because we blamed each other for what happened. She never expressed to me what she experienced after we got separated, either because she wanted me to feel guilty for leaving them behind. Oh, Karen, you have no idea. Or that she, like me, can only recall so much. We were both too shaken to recount to each other. But time and distance makes things easier. And with the advent of the internet, there was suddenly a new wealth of information. I've since begun to piece together clues. Almost immediately, I found our Hatbox ghost. Plugging that into any search engine will turn up multitudes of pictures of that bow-legged, grinning figure that was often floated through my mind's eye in the dark. It was apparently part of the attraction when it first opened in 1969, and much of the promotional material of the ride at the time featured this character in his hatbox. He originally stood in the attic scene right across from the ghostly bride with the beating heart. But that was quietly removed from the ride after only a week. Apparently the effect of his disappearing head never worked properly, or so the official account goes. In recent years, the Hatbox Ghost has gained a fan base. Groups of Haunted Mansion fans that want to see him restored to the ride. It's wishful thinking, I'm sure, because that figure had to have been stored downstairs for a reason. It took longer to find out about the backstage area where the doom buggies go. That empty corridor not only originally meant to be seen by guests, disabled guests, however, that travel that route all the time. Wheelchair access to the ride is done through the limbo-like loading room, and guests travel back around to see this room to reclaim their wheelchairs and head back out. I've posted about it and posed queries for details about that area, but no one has given me a description that sounds anything like what I went through. It's described as a short, bland, and with some sort of catwalk going over the track, but no mysterious alcove or obvious doorway. It takes less than 30 seconds for the doom buggies to go through, and then you're back in the loading room. I suspect Disney might have changed that area since the 80s, but why? Most recently, though, I've come across an odd factoid that seems more like a morbid curiosity than anything else, unless one's been through what I have. It's not about the Haunted Mansion. However, it's nearby e-ticket neighbor Pirates of the Caribbean. According to the story, and this has been published in various Disney-owned books, so it's no vague rumor, the Imagineers who built the ride felt that the fox skeletons of the time weren't convincing enough for the underground grotto scenes. So they borrowed real human remains from the UCLA Medical Center, dressed them up as pirates, and put them in the caves. Let that sink in for a moment. Millions of people went by on boats and had no idea they were looking at real skeletons, all propped up in pirate garb. Eventually, a later team of Imagineers would replace these with more convincing facsimiles, and supposedly the bones were returned to their countries of origin and given proper burial. But who's to say they were? What if something was left behind in that basement when the bones were taken? And what if Pirates wasn't the only ride that did this? The show building of the Haunted Mansion was built along with the rest of New Orleans Square in 1963, but it took another 6 years for the actual attraction to open. Why the delay? It couldn't have just been the gridlock from the 1964 World's Fair and Walt Disney's death in '66, could it? All of this is speculation. A string of understanding that raises more questions for me than it does answers. I want to get to the truth of what happened that night, but everything I found doesn't add up to a concrete explanation. Perhaps there isn't one, though I desperately want there to be. And I can't go back. I won't, not after the things I saw and felt. I haven't set foot in Disneyland since that night. Maybe it's time I've tried again. Karen, if you're out there and you're reading this, I'm sorry about everything. I'm trying to make it right, trying to put some meaning to this. Contact me if you can. I need to know what happened to you and Mike. Maybe you have the key to the mystery in your memories. I can't do it alone, but together we might get to the bottom of this. For everyone else, let this stand as a testament. Some things are backstage for a reason, and a company like Disney must have made a multitude of skeletons in its closets. Think twice before you pull some stupid stunt like I did, because it might not be security that finds you. Alright, I hope you guys enjoyed that first story for this video. Now before we sink our teeth into the next one, I just want to remind you that if any of you have any story submissions for me of your very own, whether creepypasta related or perhaps your own true horror experience, please submit it to my business email, hopegivesyouvings.com@gmail.com. Thank you. Gaston, South Carolina is a lonely little place. Sitting just south of Columbia along 321, it's just a small crumb of the misshapen piece of pie on the United States plate that we call South Carolina. Its population has almost never gone over 2,000, and it is only 3.4 square miles across in all directions. It feels even lonelier when you come from a place like Roanoke, Virginia. After Mom lost her job, we moved to the only place where the rest of our family resided, good old South Cadillac-y. I'd been moping on the trip the whole time on the way down there. The way I saw it, the only friends I was going to make there were fire ants and that inferno of a sun. Once we got settled in at 304 Dixiana Drive, I always remembered the address because the number in it was carved into the driveway, and it spelled Ho if you looked at it upside down. I immediately set out into the neighborhood in search of friends. I didn't know how to ride a bike at the time, and I barely knew how to ride a skateboard, so I petered down a long stretch of road directly across from the front of the house on my cheap little Walmart board until I came to a small cul-de-sac that seemed to go uphill. Sitting outside on his front porch was a chubby kid with glasses that looked about 10 or 11, about my age at the time. I really had no one else to talk to, so I asked what his name was, and he told me that it was Terry. He liked being outside a lot, and I didn't, but we both seemed to like video games. With that, we would get along just fine. There was one thing that he hadn't told me over the next few weeks that we had spent riding around the neighborhood. He was into scary movies. I was a massive chicken when it came to anything that seemed intent on forcing you to change your underwear every 5 minutes, so I didn't really like this aspect of him. Even worse, he had tons of horror movie action figures and loads of VHS tapes of all the creepy movies you could think of stacked in his room. Every time I came to visit, he was almost certain to scare the living bejesus out of me with one of those creepy Freddy Krueger dolls or force me to watch the Texas Chainsaw Massacre with him in the dark. His room wasn't really that nice looking to begin with. He had a bunk bed, he was an only child, and only his grandmother lived with him, in which he slept on the bottom and all his slasher flicks and action figures slept on top. There were loads of holes in the walls, and everything had a generally grimy feel to it. It made those horrifying moments of watching pure terror in the dark all the more icky. One day, when he realized that I pretty much hated any kind of horror movies, he threw at me. He began telling me urban legends. Some of them were about the town as a whole, but more than not, they were about our particular neighborhood. I didn't really believe any of them. That was until he told me about Hanging Man Hill. It was about a year after we had met each other, and we were riding around the neighborhood. By this time, Terry had told me to man up, and he had eventually taught me how to ride a bike. He stopped when we were riding in front of a house we had simply entitled the Crack Shack, due to its residents being stoned out of their minds on a regular basis. He seemed to be peering out at a small pathway behind the place that went up the farther you went back. He was usually the leader when it came to showing me new places in the neighborhood, so I didn't question a thing when he beckoned for me to follow him up the trail. It was a pretty steep climb up the side of the hill, with plenty of sand and rocks to send anyone not being careful straight back down. It felt as though the trees were closing tighter and tighter on us until we reached a large opening at the top. Besides the empty soda bottles and used condoms, the only man-made thing in the area that I could see were long stretches of telephone poles going across a series of sandy, dry hills. If not for the 2 strips of heavy forest on either side of these hills, it might have gone on forever. The area didn't seem to have any particular importance. I'd expected him to bring me to some awful cemetery, but in the dying light of the late afternoon sky, those rolling hills looked beautiful. I thought that he might try some desperate last attempt to scare me. But instead, he just turned to me with the most serious and grim face I'd ever seen on him. "Here we are, Hanging Man Hill," he whispered. "Hanging Man Hill? Is this another one of your stories?" "Sort of, except this one's true." I rolled my eyes at the thought. How did he possibly expect me to believe any of these stories? He just kept staring at me with that face, waiting for me to respond. "How could this even be a Hanging Man Hill? There's no hanging man, and there's at least 5 dozen hills here. Right down there. Look." He pointed his finger toward the nearest telephone pole, sitting between the 2 closest hills to us. A small creek, no more than 5 feet across, ran between the 2 hills, and went onward and into that never-ending forest. There was no hanging man, but the pole itself seemed more ominous than the rest. "Roy Terrace," he whispered. "Who? It wouldn't be Hanging Man Hill without a hanging man, would it?" He bolted down the first hill on that blazing orange bike of his. I tried to keep up, but Walmart and sporting goods don't seem to mix. There was a faulty chain on my cheap, dull red bike. The sticks from the surrounding trees had rooted themselves to the ground, and were now snagging onto the dangling chain. With one mighty tug of a huge root on the bike, I was head over handlebars all the way to the bottom. I landed on my knees with a small sploosh sound as my legs hit the water. It couldn't have been more than a few inches deep. I almost called for help from Terry when I realized he had stopped at the bottom just before I had tumbled to the creek alongside him. His head was peering upwards, looking straight at the top of that dark and shadowy-looking telephone pole. "Little help?" I squeaked. Terry broke his gaze with the pole just long enough to wrench me from the creek and get me to my feet. After that, his stare continued to be fixed on seemingly nothing at the top of that pole for the longest time. "What is it, or who is it that you're looking for again?" I grumbled in frustration. I was going to be pretty pissed if he had taken me down here and all I'd gotten out of the trip was a banged-up knee. I hadn't noticed the pain before because the water in the stream was cool, but now it stung like the dickens. "Roy Terrace, owner of that small shed just beyond the trees over there." I hadn't noticed the shed before. It just sat behind a large oak. It couldn't have been bigger than 5 outhouses put together. After his wife and kid left him, he hung himself on the wires just above us. Cops didn't find much, just a charred husk of what used to be a man. Legend says that whoever is out here at the exact time of his death gets strung up on the wires with him. Oh, and do tell, when would that be? For once he broke his serious tone to give me a goofy, "I don't know" shrug, and then he was back to that grim attitude. "Are you suggesting that we stay here and wait for him? Despite the many excuses I have to dispute this, I think I'm going to go with, it's late and Mom is making dinner, so I have to go home." "Fine. Tell your mom that you're sleeping over at my house tomorrow night, and I'll do vice versa with my grandma. Meet me here at 7. Against my better judgment, I decided that I might as well come. What harm did it do? Obviously he was lying, and if nothing else, it would set my mind at ease to see that he was. While none of his stories actually seemed to be true up until this point, his sudden change of tone had made it slightly more believable. When he told his other stories, he was giggling so hard that one might think he had snorted at least a pound of happy crack. When we were headed home, just as the last tint of orange had left the sky, I asked him, "Why did you get so serious back there? You're always such a goofball." "I lost my grandpa to Roy Terrace. My grandma was with him when it happened. Haven't you ever wondered why she's so grumpy all the time?" His grandmother was in fact very crotchety. I had never bothered to ask why she was that way. If this was all some elaborate hoax by Terry, I was going to slap him into next Thursday when this was done. That night I had a horrible nightmare. Like most people, I couldn't remember much about it, but it had Roy Terrace written all over it. Even though it was roasting on that hot South Carolina night, I had woken up with the chills. By the time 6 p.m. had rolled around, I had already packed my old school backpack with basic equipment like a flashlight and a few bags of Chex Mix, in case we got hungry. By 6:30, I had rolled out into the neighborhood, as fast as an overweight 11-year-old could. I had to admit, I was actually pretty excited. Finally, around 6:55, I arrived at the small creek where Terry had already set up a small fire and was roasting marshmallows. If I hadn't decided to show up, I would have disappointed him like hell. How is this exactly going to work out? Are we just going to camp out here all night? We don't know when he's supposed to show up, I said. He had stuffed his face with a marshmallow. What? He crammed the marshmallow down his throat. I said I'll wait here all night if I have to. Whatever, I retorted, as I plopped down next to his fire. He had thrown 3 lighters in to keep it lit, and began to pull out my snacks. About 3 hours, the first of the crickets had begun to sing their endless chirping song as the last streak of sun had reached its end. I had begun to grow irritated and a little bit tired. Terry was wide awake, his hand glued to the bag of marshmallows. He had begun his internal gaze on top of the pole again. Terry, man, I'm tired. If I don't see a crispy dead dude in the next hour, I'm out. Okay. His cheek stuck out like a squirrel's with another marshmallow. I snuggled up to the fire and began to doze off. Just as I was about to slip into unconsciousness, a loud, crusty, brittle peeling sound echoed through the hills and out into the forest. I immediately sat up. My vision was pretty blurred from having almost dozed off, but I could make out Terry's shape. He was gaping wide-eyed at the top of the pole. If there had been a bit of moonlight, I might have seen what I was sure to have seen up there, but the crescent moon sat just beyond the trees like the shed. In an instant, Terry was on his bike, flying up the hill, bag of marshmallows in hand. I managed to pull myself up and get to my bike. I began pedaling like a madman when I realized that my chain had popped off. Stupid damn bike. With my eyes adjusting to the dark, I peered back at the top of the pole one more time before I bolted to the top of the hill. Roy Terrace was not so much of a person as he was a sagging shape. His flesh, dark as the night, was clinging to his bones for dear life. His facial features, though not entirely evident, seemed to be in a constant state of both agony and ecstatic joy. And that eye, that one eye he had left, deep in its socket, gazed upon me with absolute hatred and insatiable want. Just when it seemed that he was ready to climb off of the wire and come for me, the weak spine that had been holding his head to the molten pile of flesh and bones snapped, sending what was left of his skull tumbling into the fire Terry had started. It gave me one more glowing, burning, satisfied grin before disintegrating into a wisp of ash. I had been halfway up the hill before I had realized I was moving. I followed the bike tracks Terry had left, which led further into the hills instead of off to the side, where the trail led back to the neighborhood. Just as I clawed my way up to the top of the hill, I saw a thin shape dangling from above. Oh no, I croaked. Terry's bike, that blazing orange bike that he'd loved so much, was left wrecked at the base of a telephone pole. Above Terry's body hung limply, although it didn't look much like Terry anymore. Terry hadn't been on the wires as long as Roy, which made it even worse. He was charred, but not entirely. His eyes bulged from his head in constant shock. What was left of his hair stood on end, still smoking. The seemingly endless wires above entangled Terry's neck like a boa constrictor. Dangling from his scrawny, burnt little arm was a bag of marshmallows, melted to his hand from the heat. The police investigation hadn't dug up much. They had scoured all throughout the area and had not found any evidence that anyone was ever there. I begged them to search the telephone wires, but they continued to state that there was no evidence that anyone had even touched the wires. The search continued for 3 weeks. After police had finally given up, Terry's grandmother passed away. For those last few days, she had not said anything to anyone at all. She only sat and stared at the picture of her and her husband for the remainder of her life. After the house had been cleared out, the contents of Terry's room were offered to me. His entire collection of horror movies, action figures, and all else was donated to Goodwill. My request. I went back a few years later. We had gone to Gaston to visit with our family for a while, and I had requested that we stop by the neighborhood. Any evidence that we had ever been there those few fateful years ago had been swept away by police or the weather. Now, like before, there was only useless garbage and telephone poles. Just as I was getting ready to walk away, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. I only saw a tiny bit of it before it fluttered away. It was a melted marshmallow bag. Before I move on to the third and final story for this video, if you've made it this far, I just want to say thank you to those who have been listening. It means so much to me. All of your support, it's greatly appreciated. And if you haven't already, please like and subscribe and hit that bell to get all notifications for every upload. Alright. And again, thank you very much. And let's move on, shall we? My name is Greg Johnson. I was recently released from Newman Community Residence in New York, where I was treated for acute schizophrenia, dissociative amnesia, and depersonalization, derealization disorder. I was sent there after my experience in the back rooms about 20 years ago. I'll start at the beginning. The last thing I remember before the back rooms is walking on the sidewalk on my way to my job as a math professor at SUNY Buffalo. On the same path that I had walked nearly every day for 3 years, I tripped. Then I was in the back rooms. For context, I had no idea what the back rooms were, and I had no words to describe what I experienced until years after the fact when I found a community for other back rooms survivors. I'll attempt to explain my experience as well as I can, but I can't remember much that happened after the first day or two in the back rooms. One thing I have to say is that the back rooms are completely empty. There's the damp carpet, the buzzing fluorescent lights, the hideous yellow walls, and nothing else as far as the eye can see. I've heard some people reporting seeing communities in the back rooms or entities that they came across. While there aren't many things I can say for certain about the back rooms, one thing I know is it is not possible to survive in the back rooms for an extended period of time, and people who say these things were either hallucinating or simply lying. Just as a dying soul in the desert might imagine he sees a fountain of water, so people, myself included, hallucinate and see people who aren't really there. After all, nothing would be more comforting in the back rooms than seeing someone else. That is, if you haven't already gone insane enough to kill them on sight. I entered the back rooms with just my lecture notes, some pens, and luckily a bottle of water. Keep in mind that this happened 20 years ago, so I didn't carry a smartphone, laptop, or anything to take pictures with. I also had no idea how much time was passing, though I think I lasted about a day before I started to get really dehydrated. I walked through countless rooms of various shapes and sizes. I was yelling for help and trying to figure out what on earth was happening. The only answer I got was the relentless buzzing of those cursed fluorescent lights. After walking as far as I could, I finally collapsed and fell asleep. I figured I'd probably wake up in my bed. After all, this couldn't be real, could it? I don't think it's possible to properly describe the feeling of suddenly being in the back rooms. Just take a minute to try to imagine, really imagine, what it would be like to slip into those back rooms right now. People like to imagine that they could go explore the back rooms, maybe survive in there. Yeah, right. First of all, I found very little evidence to suggest it's possible to choose to go to the back rooms. Everyone who ends up there gets there by accident, meaning they're totally unprepared. Besides the complete lack of food and water in the back rooms, the apparent lack of escapes, I've heard some people found exits, but they must be very rare because I've never found one. The total isolation, the constant buzzing that sets your nerves on fire, the deadliest part of the back rooms is the sheer strangeness of it. The reason everyone goes insane is because when you go to the back rooms, you eventually realize, once you get past the denial stage, that everything you thought was real may just have been an illusion. Maybe you're dead in some weird purgatory. Maybe you can't trust your senses at all. Maybe there are entities right around every corner that are getting ready to kill you. And if, God forbid, you brought a weapon with you, as some suggest you do, you'll probably end up swinging it at a non-existent foe and either wearing yourself out or killing yourself with it. After waking up and finding myself parched and still in this hellish landscape, which I now know is called the back rooms, I started thinking of all those things. Eventually, I started seeing things too. I ran away desperately from a four-legged alien-like creature that was chasing me, only to stumble, turn around and realize nothing was there. I saw doorways that turned into walls, and when I tried to walk through them, I saw people walking away from me, sipping leisurely from their water bottles, not responding to my cries for help. When I was at my wit's end and my throat had turned into a scratchy tunnel, after I would guess 2 days of yelling and dehydration, I blacked out and I don't remember anything else. As you can tell by the fact that I'm writing this, I didn't die in the back room, so what happened? I have no idea. I think I must have either woken up one last time, so tired that I don't even remember doing it, and somehow found an exit. Perhaps some colonies do exist and they found me and rescued me, though, as I said, I don't think it's possible to survive in the backrooms. And even if there were other people, the backrooms are too massive to ever find anyone else. Perhaps I simply no-clipped back into reality in my sleep. Maybe I died and God sent me back to Earth, or was implanted with false memories and reincarnated into another body. Like I said, I spent 20 years in a psychiatric residence, but I'm not a nutcase. I just acknowledge the fact that our senses lie to us, and nothing we think we know is actually real. I can still hear the lights buzzing in my head even to this day. Everyone still thinks I'm crazy, and the only reason I got released from psychiatric care is because I managed to convince them that I'm not a threat to society. Little do they know that I'm the only enlightened one. So like I said, I blackened out in the back rooms, and the next thing I remember is being in a hospital bed on September 20th, 2004. That's over 2 years after I went to the back rooms. But I've been told that I was found 5 days after my disappearance on July 15th, 2002. Completely out of my mind, roaming the streets of Rochester naked, screaming about the buzzing sound. I remember nothing from those 2 years, but my ex-wife told me that I spent most of it in an insane asylum and gradually got my sense of reality back. It's all very blurry to me, and I don't even remember when my ex-wife divorced me. I have been recovering ever since, and have finally been able to be deemed rational enough to go back to the free world. However, I know there's nothing for me here. Everywhere I look, I still see that yellow wallpaper. I have a few thoughts about the online attitude concerning the backrooms. First of all, don't believe everything you hear. I do think that other levels of the backrooms exist because of some bits of surviving footage, but a lot of people pretend to know what they're talking about when they are either completely out of their mind or just lying. Also, for the love of God, don't attempt to access the backrooms. If there is a way to voluntarily access the backrooms, do not use it. There is no known way to exit. There is no heroic exploration to be done there. I am open to the possibility that there are some levels of the backrooms that are survivable, but I spent 2 days on level 0 and I saw no exits, doors, entities, or pathways, at least none that I could say for sure weren't figments of my imagination. Keep living in blissful ignorance of the truth of reality. You'll be better off that way.